Hey everyone, welcome to this very special video where Marnix and I will be hosting a video together where we discuss what are the best video game genres to make as an indie game developer.
So not to play, but to make. If you yourself are sitting over there with your great idea and you're like, I want to make an RPG or a first-person shooter or whatever, we've basically combined all of those genres and we'll just be tier listing them because that's the meta nowadays apparently. We'll be discussing what are some of the good things about each genre and then we'll give it a score.
Of course, those are just opinions, so if you disagree, let us know down in the comments.
It boosts engagement. So I have prepared here this tier list on my laptop and I'll be going over it with Thomas. And I think our first genre, let's start pretty big. Something that a lot of people want to make as one of their first games is a first-person shooter. So think of something like, Call of Duty, Battlefield. I think almost everyone, Halo, anyone who's into games has probably played a first-person shooter at some point. And whilst in my opinion, they're quite fun to play, how good are they to actually develop in?
Well, I think they are not very good because they are often based on realism, and as an indie game developer it's very hard to create very realistic things. Think art or mechanics even. But
then you have something like Escape from Tarkov, which is also an indie game made in Unity even.
Mm-hmm. And that's also why, for example, Superhot is a great example on how it can be done. It's not impossible, but you have to have a unique mechanic to make your game unique, basically. So if you have a unique mechanic, you can make it work. It's just not a surefire hit. It's never a surefire hit, but it's not easy to get a hit.
I think if you're gonna start with just being a Call of Duty clone, you can forget to get any basically publicity or any interest. But like Thomas says, something like Superhot where you have those time mechanics coming in. And also I think made by a single guy, not sure on that one. But it's definitely still an indie game and it's a really fun experience, even with its more limited length and limited mechanics and very basic art style even.
I'd give it like a B tier.
I think B tier, low A, high B I would give it, so let's put it in there. The next genre I have prepared for Thomas is one that I personally have spent a lot of time playing. I think I have a few thousand hours in Minecraft, and it is the survival sandbox. So I already said one example, for example, is Minecraft, a very, very popular and famous indie game.
You probably never heard about it.
Very small game indeed, But also some other games, for example, are Rust or Ark, if you've known about that one, survival game. Concept is basically very simple. Subnautica, all these games, you're put somewhere, usually single player, put into a big world, and you just have to survive. You have to gather resources, you have to craft things. Generally, I think to play, those games are quite fun. However, I don't know if developing them can be the easiest. What do you think, Thomas?
Of course, we just placed our first thing, so I'm already thinking relative to what we just mentioned. I think it's already better than a first-person shooter.
I actually disagree. I think it's harder because you have, especially if you have the crafting system, you first need a very big world, and either you need to work with procedural generation, which can very quickly make your game look very boring or very stale, unless you decide to put it in a forest, and then you would still need to manually put more buildings there. And then you indeed I need to craft all of these things. One game that comes to mind is Subnautica, where you have to spend quite some time to craft everything, and that also takes a lot of time as a developer, I feel, to really think out what is my crafting system, what are all the items gonna be, and actually implementing those, because almost every item comes with its own mechanic.
I mean, true, but it's also a lot easier, I think, for this genre to give your unique twist on it. So that's why, in my opinion, a first-person shooter is very locked in, and you of course have your unicorns like Superhot. But I think with a survival game like Minecraft, Rust and Subnautica, like you mentioned, are three completely different games. It's a lot harder to say the same thing about a first-person shooter, and therefore I think it's easier to make something unique. Something unique makes you stand out more, makes you usually a better game.
I think indeed. So technically it may not be easier, but it will be easier to stand out and to really, if you're, for example, getting wish lists or something, you'll get more attention that way. So we're gonna put it at an A?
No, I put it in a B, but above first-person shooter. It's not a lot better because you of course have your technical challenges, but it can be more unique. No, I went it to the left because that's better. Yes, that's how tier list works, I think.
I'll put it like this.
Someone at home is now very tilted. Next genre we're going to cover is platformers. 2D, 3D, doesn't matter, just platforms in general. Think like your Marios, your Sonics for the big ones, or things like Shovel Knight, Celeste, things like that for an indie.
I personally don't have much experience playing these kinds of games. However, I know that like almost every Unity tutorial you look out online starts with a platformer. So from what I think, it is probably one of the easier genres to get started in, to just get your way around with how does an engine work. But I think because it's so easy to get into it, it is also a lot harder to find something that makes you unique. I think one unique platformer I can think of in recent years is Jump King. I don't know if you know it, it's this game where you basically just have to jump. It's a bit of a rage game. Very simple mechanics. I think that if you wanted to make a clone of it, you could probably do it in about a day, but still very engaging. I don't know what you think. I personally think that these are at least A-tier platformers, maybe even S-tier.
I like platformers a lot, especially when you're starting your game dev journey. I probably would suggest you to make a platform as one of your first games, because they teach you a lot of good concepts. It's easy to get started, but it's very hard to just nail controls on a platformer. You know, the game feel, something we talked about before on this channel. To make it as an indie game, I think it's probably one of the best from a technological standpoint. From a marketing standpoint, I'm not sure on that one. It depends, because if you make a 2D or 3D platform, it's entirely different beast. But I would also lean towards A or S tier. So
I would give it S. If you're leaning towards it, let's just give it S.
I mean, sure, let's give it an S.
Let's give it S tier.
Bam!
Our first S tier. The next genre I picked is one that we may be personally a bit biased in, and that is generally the concept of a top-down strategy game. So think, if you want some AAA games, think about the Civilization series, Age of Empires, stuff like that. And if you want a very good indie example, I would say our own game, Forge Industry.
There is a link down below where you can wishlist the game. Go ahead and do that right now. We'll wait for you. Just a second. Go ahead. Still waiting. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So I think we do have a bit of a bias maybe, or we have the most experience in developing this kind of genre, at least. You do most of the programming work. I just have to make the assets mostly. But I think we both have a pretty good idea of what are some of the good and the bad things about having a game like this.
Yeah, so on this kind of genre, I think it's very team specific. A lot of teams have great artists and things like that, but this is a very mechanic driven game. So you need a lot of programmers. That's also why we chose it, because almost everyone on our team is a programmer, aside from Marnix, who is like a semi-programmer. So depending on your team, this can easily be an S tier, but it can also be an F tier, because if you are 3 art guys, don't make this kind of game.
I think one problem that you also have with this game is that your audience has this expectation of it has to be really deep technically. You can't just half-ass a strategy game. You really need to show that you can put a lot of time into balancing everything, really have a lot of expansion options as well. If you look at, for example, something like Factorio, the amount of depth you can go there is really nuts. And you will always have people out there who play your game that are probably smarter than you, but it's your job to still figure out a way to have a game that can be really optimized as well, and not just, oh, all of these buildings have the same rate of production, for example. So I think, first of all, yeah, the mechanics is hard, but then actually balancing it is probably also one of the harder parts of actually making this fun to play.
Not to mention marketing, because this is a very static game, so to say. When you have a platformer, you can very easily visualize things like cool jumps, wall jumps, things like that. While in a strategy game, it's more the thought behind it, and they are more slow usually. So it's also harder to market, in my opinion. So this is a very tough one, actually, I think.
I would almost dare say C tier.
Yeah, I was also thinking C tier.
Yeah.
We really made a mistake with our game, damn.
We're too committed now. We can't back down.
Sunken cost fallacy.
So generally, we don't recommend you, if you're starting out as an indie developer, don't make games like this as your first project. Don't do like what we did. We'll probably survive, but that's also, as he said, because we have the team behind it.
Yeah, we're playing to our strengths, and you should do the same. So for you, this can be an S tier, but it can also be an F tier. With every game genre, basically, play to your strengths.
Keeping on to that topic of very deep mechanics, I think the next one also fits that bill a bit, and that's simulation games. So for example, Farming Simulator, Euro Truck Simulator, or even more niche games such as Gamedev Tycoon is one that I think about, or Roller Coaster Simulator, stuff like that. Basically, the concept of getting the game idea is very easy. You just walk around in your life and you pick one thing, you're like, oh, I see plants, I'm gonna make a gardening simulator or whatever.
I thought you were gonna say plant simulator.
Both of them probably exist, but it's both easier and harder to make these games because you have a very well-defined, I think scope creep is a bit harder here, because if I have a simulator about farming, I'm never gonna implement planes, I hope. Again, the issue that I see, however, is you really need to know your stuff. If you have, for example, a shipping simulator, I think that your audience will demand some like actual real-world shipping lingo, and you have to know how it works.
Yeah, you have to know the talk from the business, so to say, the business talk, the business guys. What I do think is good about this genre, I think it's very similar actually to what we just mentioned about strategy games. But like Marnix said, your scope is more narrow, which is always a good thing. I think the downside of this is you also can't really marketing just like strategy games. Well, you can, but it's harder than the more visual things like shooters and
I think it
platformers.
can be more visual. If you look at, for example, Euro Truck Simulator, you're actually driving around the truck. However, you will always have a smaller audience to market the game to.
But it's also good to have a good view on who your audience is, so it's also an upside.
Yeah, if you have a more restricted audience, you can very narrowly focus in on what are they actually interested in. If you have a train simulator, you can really, most people who are interested in trains really care about the exact model numbers and version numbers of specific train locomotives, for example. And you can also let that show out in your marketing material, for example, that you are in fact really deep with it. That's one advantage.
Purely development-wise, I think it's a bit of the same. You're pretty mechanically intensive, but also an extra challenge, I think, with simulator games is there are simulator games that strive for realism once again. So your art is also probably has to be more detailed than with a strategy game. So it's a very hard one once again. Why did we pick these genres?
You're welcome. There's never an easy answer to game development, or everyone would be one.
Yeah, I think maybe just slightly above real-time strategy, just because you are more inclined to keep to your scope and because you have a clear goal of who your audience is, while it's a lot harder with certain other
So
genres.
more of a C+, whereas strategy would be more of a C-.
Yeah, so also to the left.
No, I'll do it like this.
The next game genre we're going to cover is puzzle games, things like, yeah, with your brain, things like Portal or Baba Is You, which is an indie game. I don't think Marnix just thinks I made it up, but
Yeah.
it's real, it's pretty fun. Or Tellus Principle.
Yeah, some other games are Tellus Principle, for example, or The Witness is one that I've also played.
And like a million more that we can't think of right now.
But I think there's a reason why there are a million more that we can't think of right now. And that's that I think these are actually some of the more easy to make as an indie games. So my idea is that most of these games are also single player or at most co-op. So you don't have to deal with the whole networking aspect that much. And it's also very something you can really put your creativity and your uniqueness in to make your game stand out. It's really easy for a puzzle game to stand out. For example, think about the non-Euclidean puzzle games that are currently a bit of a hype in game development, where these people who make puzzles where you have to work through dimensions even. And I think once you have that core mechanic figured out of, okay, what is my game really going to be about? I think the actual development process of creating your levels is relatively smooth sailing and code-wise a bit more limited. You just need either first-person or third-person camera controller or whatever. And then once you have the original mechanic, you just have to make a bunch of levels and maybe put in a bit of a story, and that's it.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I think pure mechanic-wise, it's probably one of the easier ones to make. You also have a lot more freedom, like Marnix said. The main challenge here is making a lot of content and good content at that. So I'm pretty inclined to give it like an A tier.
Yeah.
I wouldn't dare put it in S tier because I still think platformer is better, to get started at least. But an A tier is pretty safe, I think.
Yeah, I think if this is your second game maybe that you're working on, then it will be S tier definitely if you want to move out of the platformer. If this is your first game, maybe wait with the puzzle, because sometimes it can be really frustrating, because in these games you maybe not always make a lot of progress until suddenly you figure out your mechanic, and then it goes quickly. But I think this is still one of the better options you can have if you want to make a unique indie game.
And this is also great to learn more about game design, I think. So if that's something you want to learn about, it might be worth a shot. Next genre, RPGs. This is a very broad topic. You can even say things like World of Warcraft. If you want to make an MMORPG, you can put it in F tier. It's dumpster.
It's not World of Warcraft that's dumpster.
No, yeah.
It's the multiplayer online aspect, the MMO part. We didn't even really include that one here because don't do it. It's dumb. You don't have the funding for it, you don't have the marketing for it, you don't have the technical skills for it. Skip the MMO part, at least.
Yeah. The other part, RPG, you can think of things like Skyrim, but also things like Stardew Valley even are RPGs.
Yeah.
So it's a very broad, genre, but in this case, I think we'll mostly be focusing on the fantasy RPGs. So things like The Witcher, Genshin Impact, or Undertale, a very popular indie option, or even Hades.
I think these are like a trap. Everyone loves RPGs, playing them. Everyone wants to make RPGs. We even wanted to make an RPG before we grew brains, I guess. I'll put on some footage of that one probably. The problem is the scale of an RPG. A good RPG, if you look at something like The Witcher, is 100 or 80 hours. Breath of the Wild, 40 hours to 80 hours as well. Skyrim, I mean, if you just do the main storyline already is I think 20 hours, and most people, if you add in mods, is like 500 to 1000 hours. Making content that big, and also in RPG you need to have a story. And we're game developers mostly, I guess, who's watching this, and not story writers. And whilst you can easily make stories, basic ones, an RPG, your story really needs to be very core to your game. And if you have a bad story, which is quite easy to get if you're not really experienced, your game falls apart.
I agree, but I also disagree.
Okay.
What I mean by that is, I also mentioned Undertale, for example, and I think this is an example of an RPG game that works very well for the funding it had. It was made by one guy, I think Toby Fox. He made everything. So depending on what you envision as an RPG, if you want to make the next Witcher, don't. If you want to make something like Undertale, or even if it's in a 3D world, something that is at least limited by scope, it is possible. But like Marnix said, it's probably a trap, so be careful with that one.
I think scope creep also is probably the biggest issue you can have here, because you start big with RPGs usually. You have this grand vision, and then you dial it down a little bit, but then during your development, it's very easy to expand upon it again. Whereas, I've had good RPG experience, for example, Evoland. I think it takes about 3 hours to play. I was very happy throughout the entire playthrough, basically. Don't do this as your first game. That's number one. And even then, I would put it at the D tier, maybe even. I think, of course, RPG is very broad. Like you said, we have Stardew Valley and Skyrim both counting as an RPG. But I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it unless you have at least a few people maybe working on your team as well. If you're solo, Stardew Valley took 6 years to make, don't do that. You're never gonna survive that long, most likely.
I think D tier is fair, but if you want to make something like Undertale, you can maybe put it in like a B tier.
Yeah, but in general, we'll put it as a D tier.
Yeah.
I think the next one we don't really need to say that much about. It's the massive online battle arena, or MOBA. Think about Dota or League of Legends as some big names. Generally, what is the concept? You have a set arena and you have two teams playing against each other. So that's fault one. It's multiplayer and it requires like 6 to 10 people for a game to start. If you have a small game, if you don't have a big following, it can already be very hard for your players to even be able to start unless you start implementing like AI companions, but usually they're always quite dumb.
When your genre starts with massive, it's probably not a good idea to make it as an indie game developer. And even if you want to make it, think right now to yourself, are you a network engineer? If the answer is no, you shouldn't make one. If the answer is yes, you probably still shouldn't make one. The networking part is very easily underestimated. You have to make predictions. You have to make sure it's very low on latency, things like that. You have to have a server even. Who even has funds for that?
And not just one server. You'll need servers throughout the entire world because, of course, you can't have 500 milliseconds of ping usually for these kinds of games as well.
As an indie, I would probably put it in F tier. It's also a trap, a bit like the MMO part we just mentioned. Like I said, if it starts with massive, the scope is too massive. Don't do it.
I agree. Let's put this one at F tier. and move on. The next genre is one that I personally like to play a lot, or is really fun, at least in my opinion, and that is rhythm games. So Just Dance, as our AAA basically example, or something like Guitar Hero. Concept is simple, you need to follow the beat, and you have good soundtracks or whatever.
With a saber even.
Beat Saber, indeed, also a very good example. I think these games, again, concept-wise, are very easy to develop. I think just the concept of Beat Saber can be done really easily. The problem here is you need to have someone on your team, or even multiple people who are dedicated to music. Unless you want to license a shit ton of popular songs, which you probably don't really have the money for as an indie, it's going to be very hard to really make it that engaging.
Yeah, I think technically it's not that hard to make. You can even pretty easily make it feel good, like game feel wise, but the content is very hard to create because no one loves a music game, or a rhythm game, my bad, where they're all generic songs that just some guy made. Everyone loves oh, I'm playing the latest pop song, or this heavy metal thing in Beat Saber, which is pretty cool. So I think that's your main challenge. Also, I think the modding community is like a large part of what keeps those games alive. For example, Trombone Champ is another example of a rhythm game, and like you can play a lot of mods for it with custom tracks, and that's pretty cool, and it really boosts how long people play your game. So if you would make one, I would probably suggest some way of people having to create custom levels. It also maybe lets you avoid licensing costs.
Yeah, licensing can also be a pretty big problem, I feel. I would, in general, stay away from this genre. However, unless you can, first of all, you need modding support, I think, in general. However, you need that player base for modding support to start, and to get that player base, you need to have either be lucky and go viral on like something like Reddit or whatever, or just pump a lot of money into marketing or whatever. If you look at something like Osu, I don't know how it got popular. It's also a rhythm game, but that one they didn't have ads, but it's just through online that it got popular. But it's not something you can really easily bet on. So if you're just wanting to make something for fun, that maybe you can jam to with your friends or whatever, fine, but I wouldn't really look at this if you're planning on a lot of money, for example, once your game releases. I would say E tier or D tier.
I think it should actually be both RPGs, because RPGs are a bigger trap. This is also a trap.
Everything's a trap. Make platformers for the end of life.
But I actually think it's easier to make a good rhythm game and make it work than to make a good RPG game and make it work.
That's true. So C then? Or what would you would even go higher?
No, I put it in D, but above above RPGs.
Okay. We're gonna kill people with this tier list, but hey.
This is not how it's supposed to be done.
Hey.
Next up is racing games. Think like Gran Turismo, Need for Speed from back in the day. I think
Inertial Drift, another one. I'm not sure. I think games like My Summer Car and even BeamNG Drive, whilst maybe not as much racing, still very much car focused, are indie developer games as well.
Yeah, about this genre, I think it's a pretty bad one actually.
Oh, I think it's pretty good because the mechanics are quite easy. You just need to have a car that can drive down somewhere. And of course, I think the hardest part here is just like shooters standing out. So I think what makes, for example, BeamNG stand out is their physics engine and how you can really bang the shit out of your car and have it like all crumpled up. But in the end, it's just W makes the car go forward, S makes the car slow down. Programming wise, development wise, quite easy. Slap in some low poly models and you have a very basic game.
Yeah,
so why?
It might be easy to get it started, but to make a good one, I think it's very hard because a lot of these racing games are on the edge of realism, or they go the arcade route. It's either one of the two. And if you strive for realism, it's very hard because every car has to feel unique. Think like when you play Gran Turismo, the interior of the car is completely realistic. The way they drive should be realistic. And they all handle in a different way. So there are a lot of tweaking to do. Your models have to be realistic if you go that route. It's very hard, I think. If you go the arcade route, maybe something like Mario Kart?
I think arcade or just arcade racer even, because we're not just limited to cars for racing games. We can also make like spaceship racing games or whatever, where you do have more options for creativity, add in like some missiles or whatever. Yeah. I think don't go for realism at least. If you go for a realism racing game, you're screwed. Yeah. But I think if you can make it more arcadey, Give it something unique. I think it can be quite good. Also, what I personally experience with the realism games is that game feel can be quite hard. For example, if you look at a video of like someone racing their car at 200 kilometers an hour in like some game, it doesn't feel exciting. It's really hard to convey that speed through a computer screen often. And it really hinders a lot of game feel, I find. I would just say go for arcade if you're gonna make something. And if you're going for arcade, I think I can put this as a B tier, honestly.
I would go C tier because there is arcades. If you go for realism, it's probably E tier or something like that. But I think it's hard to put it very high, so probably a C.
I would put it B still though, because it's so easy to get started with as a developer as well.
It's easy to get started, but it's hard to...
It's hard for very big success, I feel, but if we're looking at you guys who are probably after this video gonna be Googling or YouTubing Unity and then whatever genre we put as S tier tutorial, I think that this is still a pretty good idea.
I can live with B tier then.
Let's put this at B tier, assuming that you're going for an arcade style.
And last but not least is a MetroidVania game. For those who don't know, well, what's in the name? Metroid and Castlevania, MetroidVania. It's kind of a platformer, but not entirely, because it's not just a platformer. There's also a bit of combat. And what is very typical about these kind of games is that you revisit the same places. And because you had upgrades for some way, you can jump higher, for example, you can now reach new parts of the map. Examples is like I said, Metroid, Castlevania, or things like Hollow Knight or Dead Cells. I think these are not as good as a platformer, but I think they still rank very high.
Yeah, because they do share some of the platformer DNA in the end. So of course they will have some of the good looking genes. I think maybe a bit of more of an issue compared to regular platforms is that you need more content, because you need to be able to revisit. So you'll probably need a bit more planning into how am I gonna make everything interact with each other, make it still a bit balanced. Mechanics wise, I think it should be quite okay to implement. But here I think you'll be spending more time on really tweaking your levels, for example, making your combat feel good, stuff like that.
Yeah, I agree. Another thing that I don't think is pretty bad about it is there was a time period where no one was making Metroidvanias, but they are now getting popular again. So a lot of indies are making Metroidvanias now. And yeah, that also means you have a lot more competition. Even though I just said that, I would still put it in A tier.
I was thinking A tier as well, like low A, but still A, I think, in general.
Yeah, I agree.
You agree? Okay, hey, you brought up this genre. And that basically wraps up this first edition of the tier list. I have no idea how this video is going to pan out. If you've managed to stick around until now, very much thank you for watching so far.
Good job.
We know that, of course, there are so many different genres that we could still cover, but we figured that, hey, maybe let's not go for a 5-hour video as our first one. If you want to know some more genres, for example, feel free to leave them in the comments down below, and we'll maybe make a V2 of this video where we cover some more random genres that you guys suggest. If you're new here, as you saw, we made this content specifically for game developers. That's what this channel does in general. So we make game development tips and tricks, basically. Not the full-on code part usually, but more on how do I run my game dev business and things like that. If that's something that you're interested in, be sure to subscribe and leave us a like, as it really helps us and you also get this cool content. I think I've said everything. We've taken enough of your time, so now is the time for you to go and look up how to make a platformer, Metroidvania or puzzle game in Unity or whatever engine you prefer, and start working on your own dream.
Don't forget to add in 5 quick easy steps or 10 minutes to your search.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!